Hello, everyone. Professor Sackett-Taylor here with a two-part video lecture on Chapter 13 from Principles of Macroeconomics on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This model is going to build off of literally everything we've done to this point in the semester. Just before this, we were thinking about economic growth and development. We looked at the evolution of three economic growth models. The first solo model really focused on capital investment as the main source of economic growth. A couple years later, or I should say a couple decades later, we updated this model to include technology as an additional source of growth, treating it exogenously, meaning from outside of the society or the model itself. Modern growth theory now has updated it even further to recognize the role of institutions for creating an environment that fosters economic growth. We also treat technological advancements in a society as institutional decisions and therefore endogenous to the model itself. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is an extension of the supply and demand model that we learned at the very beginning of the semester. We're going to be looking at the different components of GDP that make up aggregate demand: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Then we'll look at the different things that can impact aggregate supply in the short run and in the long run. This will be able to tell us something about how we can understand whether the macroeconomy is in expansion or recession. It will also help us to understand factors such as interest rates and unemployment rates. In macroeconomics, we tend to take two separate paths of study. One is that we look at long-run growth and development, which is a focus on the theories and policies that might affect an economy over the period of several decades. Whereas a second path of study is short-run fluctuations, or what we call business cycles. This is a focus on a time horizon of 5 years or fewer. In a business cycle, we'll be able to see how real GDP and unemployment may change as a result of some real-world factors. As a reminder, during economic expansion, we're seeing positive GDP growth, while during recession, it's typically negative. In a recession, we're going to see unemployment levels rise, while during expansion, unemployment levels will fall. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply is a model that is used to study business cycles. It's another supply and demand model similar to the basic model that we learned earlier this semester, but the differences are the key. We're aggregating. So instead of getting the price and quantity of a single good, which is in our typical supply and demand model that we already looked at, we're looking at supply and demand for all the final goods in an economy. In that way, aggregate, this word, means total. So we're not looking at a single price, but at price levels. And this is going to be what we measure on the vertical axis, just like price was in our original model. It's going to be the average price level in the economy, measured by the GDP deflator, which we talked about in Chapter 6. Overall output, or the quantity measure on the horizontal axis, is real GDP. We learned how to calculate real GDP in Chapter 6 as well. Aggregate demand is the total demand for final goods and services in an economy. So therefore, we can think of it as the sum of spending. To determine aggregate demand, we sum up spending from each of the 4 different sources in the economy, which create our equation that should look very familiar to you as the equation for overall GDP. The C is consumption. These sources include private domestic consumers who buy things like cars, food, clothing, education, many other goods and services. I is investment. This is primarily from business firms. where they buy resources that they need to produce future output. G is government spending. The government is a large purchaser of labor and other resources that we use to produce government services or public services for society. And finally, NX is net exports. Foreign consumers may buy many goods and services produced in the United States, just like we buy things that are produced elsewhere. Net exports is equal to exports, meaning it's exiting the country, minus imports, meaning it's coming into the country. So like I said before, the aggregate demand model is going to measure real GDP measured in dollars on the horizontal axis. This is a quantity of spending. And the vertical axis is price level, where the price level of 100 is the price of the consumer basket in the base year. So prices above 100 represent an increase in overall prices, and prices below 100 represent a decrease in overall prices relative to that base year. So here we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And believe it or not, the reason it's downward sloping is not as simple as it was before in the supply and demand model, where we simply talked about the law of demand. Here, aggregate demand is downward sloping due to 3 factors, and I'm going to expand on those in the future slides. We can see that if we were to think about the base year in which the price level is 100, real GDP in the base year in this example is $20 trillion. The slope of the aggregate demand curve is negative, and primarily for 3 reasons: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. We're going to break these down one by one. The wealth effect is a change in the quantity of aggregate demand, so remember, quantity of spending, that results from wealth changes that are due to price level changes. So some examples of wealth that you might think about are the way that you hold currency, stocks, bonds, expensive artwork, real estate, right? There's lots of ways that we hold wealth. And here, the wealth is the net value of a person's accumulated assets. So the wealth effect is related to consumption. Let me give you an example here. If the price level rises, meaning that overall prices have gone up relative to the base year, it means that a person's purchasing power has fallen. Their dollars no longer go as far, and people cannot buy as much. So therefore, that C as part of the aggregate demand equation, consumption, would fall. On the other hand, if price levels fall, so overall prices go down, your dollars now go further. In other words, your purchasing power of wealth has risen. You're now able to buy more, and that C piece of aggregate demand, consumption, would rise. So the wealth effect is directly going to be related to the C in this equation for aggregate demand, consumption. The next reason why aggregate demand has a negative slope is because of the interest rate effect. So I just want to remind you here, there's a cost to borrowing, right? Higher interest rates means that taking out a loan is more expensive because that's the cost of borrowing that money. And when fewer people are taking out loans, this decreases overall economic activity in sectors that are sensitive to interest rates. So the interest rate effect occurs when a change in the price level leads to a change in interest rates, and therefore will affect the I in this equation, investment. This is all going to happen through the loanable funds market, which we looked at just a few chapters ago. Changes in the price level is going to affect savings rates through interest rates, and that directly impacts the supply of loanable funds. So let me give you an example. As price levels rise, things get more expensive, And so the ability of the individual to save actually falls. They're probably putting less money into savings. This lowers the supply of loanable funds. When the supply of loanable funds goes down, interest rates rise. And so at higher interest rates, purchases of goods and services on credit are likely to decline. So this is mainly going to be a drop in the variable I, investment, but some large ticket consumer goods as well. So it could affect consumption. Let's look at the other example. Price levels fall. When price levels fall, things are overall cheaper and our money goes further. So people's ability to save increases. If there's more going into savings, it increases the supply of loanable funds. When the supply of loanable funds is higher, interest rates fall. And so purchases of goods and services on credit is likely to increase. This is also true for investment. Finally, the international trade effect. This occurs when a change in the price level leads to a change in the quantity of net exports. So let's consider the domestic, that is US market. Changes in the US price level of our own currency mean that the prices of US goods will change relative to the price of goods from other nations. And so this is what affects the quantity of imports and exports. If price levels in the United States increase, assuming that all the other countries, their price levels remain the same, then it makes US made goods relatively more expensive. And so our exports will fall because people will be buying goods from elsewhere rather than buying our US expensive goods. The price of foreign goods would be relatively cheaper, even though those prices haven't changed. And so exports will fall and imports will rise because we'll begin buying more foreign products. So if exports fall and imports rise, that means net exports get smaller. The international trade effect is going to be directly related to that variable NX in the GDP equation. So now we can see that there are 3 reasons why we have a negative slope to the aggregate demand function or the aggregate demand curve. So at a price level of 100 in the base year, let's say that the quantity of aggregate demand is $20 trillion. When the price level rises from 100 to 110, the quantity of aggregate demand will fall from 20 trillion down to $19 trillion. There's a couple effects happening here. The first is the wealth effect. The wealth effect implies that at higher price levels, this will lower consumption because real wealth or purchasing power has fallen. The second effect is the I for investment. At higher price levels, we will have fewer people saving, which reduces the supply of loanable funds. This means that interest rates will increase, and this will lower the quantity of investment during that time period. Finally, we see the international trade effect, NX. International trade effect will imply that at higher price levels domestically, we'll see fewer exports and more imports because foreign goods become relatively less expensive compared to our domestic price levels. So therefore, we'll have fewer exports and more imports, which means net exports declines. Each of these effects has a negative relationship with price levels. So as price levels go up, consumption goes down, investment goes down, and net exports go down, and vice versa. So let's practice what we know. When considering the wealth effect, which refers to the change in purchasing power of money as a result of a price level change, the wealth effect can help us explain the negative slope of the aggregate demand curve. If price levels fall, we can afford to buy more goods, and so our consumption goes up. Price levels down, aggregate demand up. Just like in our original supply and demand model, we can talk about shifts of the aggregate demand curve. When people's demand for goods and services at all price levels change, that's going to imply that the curve itself will shift completely to the right or completely to the left. Remember, right is more, left is less. There are 4 main categories in aggregate demand, and each of these categories will be discussed in the next 4 slides as to what may shift them. Remember, aggregate demand is essentially the total spending on final goods and services in our economy, or GDP. So the 4 categories are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumption spending accounts for 70% of all GDP. It's the largest category. Consumption is influenced by changes in real wealth and by general expectations of the future. So for example, changes in real wealth might be a result of stock market changes. If stock market value rises, people feel wealthier and they buy more goods, which results in an increase in consumption and therefore a shift to the right of aggregate demand. In terms of expectations of the future, we can have expectations about changes in our own income or just general confidence about the well-being of the economy as a whole. If consumers are more worried about the future, they tend to increase savings now and buy fewer goods. This would result in a consumption decrease, which would be a shift of the aggregate demand curve to the left. Finally, we are also affected by taxes. Taxes are essentially a mechanism by which our prices are altered as the result of policy. And so if there's a tax increase, in general, taxes go up, then our after-tax income will be less. And so we think of our income as being not able to afford as many things, and so consumption will fall. This is often the purpose of a tax, like we talked about in an earlier chapter. But at higher tax rates, we'll see lower consumption, which is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Now let's talk about the second factor, investment. Investment shifts when decision makers at firms, mostly businesses, decide to increase or decrease spending on capital goods, which is an investment in their ability to produce more output in the future. Investment is going to be linked to investor confidence, interest rates, and total money supply, the quantity of money available in the economy. Investor confidence explains why firms might want to consider the future of an investment project. The long-term nature of benefits from an investment are going to be what an investor is kind of using as the metric for how much to invest now. So if investors are very confident in their ability to get a strong return on investment, they're likely to invest now, hoping for future returns. At lower interest rates, it's cheaper to borrow money. And so obviously at lower interest rates, there'll be more people borrowing to invest in capital. And so investment overall will go up. Finally, money supply. We talked about money supply and how it affects inflation. But in general, more money in the economy is going to lower interest rates. And so with lower interest rates, we're going to see increases in overall investment activity. Government spending is a factor that's influenced most directly by policymakers. Government spending is the component of aggregate demand in economic theory that economists actually have the least to say about. It's mostly influenced by government policy, and that may or may not be driven by actual economic conditions. Sometimes the government creates policies to counteract current economic issues. This is going to be discussed further in the next 2 chapters when we talk about fiscal and monetary policy. But in general, if people become more pessimistic about the future, they'll lower their spending and investment now. And the government might choose to offset that by increasing government spending to keep GDP growth on track. Finally, net exports. Net exports shift in response to changes in the value of the US dollar on the international currency market. So this is something we haven't talked too much about. And if you are interested in the value of currencies and how they interact with foreign currencies, you should take my course on international economics. We go into it in depth there. But in general, we can think about this as foreign income. So as the income in other nations rise, they'll demand more US goods. So as other nations become wealthier, our exports, meaning exiting our country, will increase. When the value of our dollar increases, people in the US can buy more foreign goods. And so if the value of our dollar increases, then we'll buy more foreign goods, fewer US goods. And so net exports, we would send less out and be bringing more in. And so this is where net exports would decrease. So essentially, the stronger the dollar, we're going to see a decline in net exports. So this is a nice slide for your notes. This is a summary of all the different shifting factors for aggregate demand. And you can see that they're broken down by the 4 components. GDP, or aggregate demand in the form of the quantity of spending, is broken into consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And we can see that consumption factors are related to our real wealth, the expectations of what might happen to our income in the future, and how our income is impacted by tax policy. Investment factors are related to the confidence that firms have in returns on their investment, prevailing interest rates at the time, and the overall quantity of money supply. Government spending is the one we have the least control over and can say the least about. The government chooses to spend money, sometimes to support and sometimes to counteract different economic issues. And finally, net export factors are directly related to the strength of our currency relative to the strength of foreign currency. And that is, how far does our dollar go when we're exchanging it for other currencies? So let's practice what we know. If we're considering just the aggregate demand curve and consumption broadly increased across the entire economy, what would we expect it to cause? Well, because consumption is a factor of aggregate demand, if consumption increases, we would also see an increase in aggregate demand, which is a shift. Here they say outward, we think shift to the right. A quick note here that there is a difference, just like in our regular supply and demand model, between a movement along the curve and a shift of the curve. A movement along the curve is only ever caused by a change in the price level itself. This will affect the quantity of aggregate demand through 3 effects: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. That was that graph that I showed you where we were moving from one point on the curve to another point on the same curve. The difference is that shifts in the aggregate demand curve occur when something else changes other than the price level. So assuming that there's exogenous factors, other things happening outside of the model. Examples might be changes in our real wealth, changes in business confidence, changes in the value of the dollar. Those things are going to shift the aggregate demand curve at all price levels, either to the right, meaning increase, or to the left, meaning decrease. So this is where we're going to stop for now. Where I pick up is with the aggregate supply side of this model. So hang on tight for this next video in this 2-part lecture series. See you then.